For those of you who are into philosophy, I was a philosophy professor for a decade. And of course, prior to that decade, I had a decade of just studying, for a PhD and stuff like that. So I'm very familiar with all the philosophical issues. I particularly focused not so much on the philosophy of mind stuff, although I did a little bit of phil mind, but primarily on ethics. I left academia about 2.5, 3 years ago, and started this consultancy around the ethical risks of AI. One thing that I want to highlight is that I'm really talking about AI ethics in the context of business. So as opposed to talking about it in the context of regulation. I've got things to say about that, but this particular presentation will focus on the business side of things as opposed to say what regulators ought to be doing, what activists ought to be doing, et cetera. All right, so here we go. And I'll definitely need time for Q&A because I can only hear myself speak for so long before I get nauseous. All right, so the first thing is I want to distinguish between AI for good and AI for not bad. So lots of people talk about AI ethics, and I distinguish it between AI for good on the one hand, AI for not bad on the other. AI for good is, hey, we've got this awesome tool, this powerful AI. We want to do really amazing things that have positive social impact. And that's great. That's AI for good. It's wonderful. It's usually the province of nonprofits, maybe CSR, which is related. And what I'm focused on, though, is AI for not bad. Right? So you've got some, let's say you're a business, you have some at least ethically neutral goals. You want to hire people, you want to be more efficient, you want to market to people, market your product to various people. Those are, I take it to be relatively ethically neutral goals, and it's not as though they're noble goals. And the question is, how do we use AI for those ethically neutral goals in a way that doesn't really ethically mess things up, that doesn't meet a bunch of massive pitfalls? So I'm a AI for not bad person as opposed to an AI for good person, although I think the AI for good people are great. Now, when we talk about AI ethics, there are what the other speakers have talked about as well. There's what I like to call the 3 dark horsemen of AI or ML ethics. One of those things is, as everybody knows, there's biased algorithms. There are black box algorithms. And then there are privacy violations. So these are the 3 go-to concerns, especially in a business context. What are the ethical risks of AI? It's biased or discriminatory algorithms or models. It's black boxes and it's privacy violations. That says, why should your clients care? So why should businesses care? The question is, all right, you've got these AI ethical concerns. You've got ethical concerns generally. Businesses are in the business of making money standardly. So why should they actually care about AI ethics? And here, I think there are straightforward pragmatic concerns. Let me give you a couple. I mean, the general point here is that AI ethical risks, and notice I'm talking the language of risk as opposed to just ethics. So it's ethical risk. Businesses understand the language of risk. Ethical risk is reputational risk. It's regulatory risk. It's legal risk. IBM, for example, is under investigation for allegedly misappropriating data that they collected with their ubiquitous weather app. Optum is a healthcare company in the States. They're under investigation for an AI that allegedly recommends to doctors and nurses to pay more attention to white patients than to sick or Black patients. Goldman Sachs also under investigation for an allegedly discriminatory algorithm against women, this time for setting credit limits for the Apple Card. Facebook is Facebook. Everybody knows. Somebody's going to mute their microphone.
Hipóteses diagnósticas reais, orgânicas.
Hello?
Quem vai poder te explicar é o neurologista ou o otorrino, especialista no sono.
If you're talking now and you can hear me, would you please?
Vislumbrar hipóteses diagnósticas para te dar
Should I just scream? Can people hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you, but we mostly hear the other
person talking. So if they can be shut down, it would be great.
Harold Baraldo, it's you.
Cool. Are we good now? We're good.
Yep.
Right, good.
Yes.
Okay, so blah, 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 blah. And Sidewalk Labs, a subsidiary of Google, they received a ton of political backlash because they were creating a smart city within Toronto, and they were very much opaque about what they were going to do, what data they were collecting, what they would do with it. So from these very public cases, and there are many more, businesses have to ask, how much time and resources does it take to respond to a regulatory investigation? How many millions are spent paying a fine if you've been found guilty or negligent of violating regulations and laws? And my favorite, how many hundreds of millions of dollars does a company need to spend to rebuild trust? And one of the things to note here is that when you realize an ethical risk using AI, you don't do it just a little bit, right? It's not that you just hurt this one person. The point of AI is to do things at scale. So when you ethically mess up, you do it at scale automatically. So it's very dangerous. It can be very dangerous to use because you can absolutely destroy the trust of your consumers and the general citizenry. Okay, so that's roughly why businesses should care. Of course, look, I said, I was an ethicist for 20 years, right? That was my primary thing. So you should do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. I'm on board. But businesses need more than that if they're going to spend their budget on identifying and mitigating those risks. And at least some of those reasons have to do with the reputational, regulatory, and legal risks. Okay, question, what are the most common approaches in industry at the moment? The most common approach is people just cross their fingers and they're hoping that nothing bad happens. That's not ideal, where people are moving away from that slowly, but it is happening. But right now, that's surely the most common approach. The next thing that people do is that there's a big focus on bias mitigation. Huge. I mean, if there's something that a company is doing, it's 99% of the time, they're doing something around identification and mitigation of bias. And there are various technical tools that they'll use to vet for bias. The way that those technical tools work, which will be relevant for something else I say in a minute, the model has a certain set of outputs. You take those outputs, you compare them against various metrics for fairness as found in the machine learning ethics literature, which has been growing. And then you see if the outputs distribute goods or services in a way that's not equitable across various subpopulations, gender, race, etc. So that's the thing that people are doing if they're doing anything. There's a secondary focus on explainability and privacy. So there's talk about it. There are some companies who do stuff on explainability, but it's certainly secondary. Now, here's my general claim that I really want you, if you're going to pay attention to anything, pay attention to this. The common approach leaves a tremendous amount of risk on the table. Ethical risk, reputational risk, and so on. And let me explain why. These bias detecting tools that are the go-to approach, they've got a bunch of problems. So one is that they don't even cover all the forms of bias. So like I said, what they standardly do is they compare model outputs, which are distributing goods or services across subpopulations. So we're giving loans or mortgages or interviews, et cetera, to this group of people at this rate and that group of people at that rate. So that's one way you can think about bias, but there are other ways in which bias exists. So for instance, infamously, Google labeled pictures of Black people gorillas. That doesn't have anything to do with distribution of goods and services. These technical tools don't cover that form of bias. So we're talking about AI ethics, and we narrow down to these bias detecting tools, but they don't even cover all forms of bias. So we're talking about a subset of AI ethics at this point. The other thing is that I said that there are dozens of metrics for fairness in the ML literature, okay? The problem is that they're not compatible. You can choose the model that, if you like, maximizes true positives, or you can choose the one that minimizes false negatives, but those are going to be, in many cases, incompatible. So in other words, what you'll get is, okay, we're fair on these metrics, according to these metrics, we're unfair according to those. And now you have a non-technical, substantive, qualitative, ethical question, which is, what is the appropriate metric to use in this particular use case? What's the appropriate metric to use in this particular use case? And this is not a question that data scientists and engineers are well suited to make. Not due to any defect of character, not even due to stuff around implicit bias, but simply because they lack the education, knowledge, and experience around these kinds of substantive ethical issues. And then for a kicker, one of the other problems with these bias detecting tools is that they threaten to be illegal. In particular, they threaten to run afoul of anti-discrimination law. So anti-discrimination law standardly disallows using protected subclasses in decision making. So you can't choose, for instance, you can't use the fact that someone is Black or a woman as part of your decision-making process for whether you say give them a loan or deny them a loan, give them an interview or don't give them an interview, give them a high risk rating for criminal justice purposes or a lowest rating, so on and so forth. These bias mitigation tools explicitly take that kind of data to see how your outputs are distributed across those various demographics. And then you might adjust your threshold, that is to say whether someone gets, if you like, an up vote or a down vote on the decision you're trying to make. You adjust your thresholds in light of that distribution according to your fairness checker. But now what you've done is you've taken that demographic data and built it into your decision-making process, which looks like it's in tension with anti-discrimination law. So now you've got, if you're a business, you've got a really tough decision to make. Okay, we're going to build this, we're going to train this model. We can do it in a way that's totally legal, but then we're going to fail to that for certain kinds of biases. So we're going to push out a legally compliant but biased model. That's a bad option. Okay, we're going to vet for bias using these technical tools. They are helpful. And now we're going to push out a mitigated biased model that is illegal, or the way in which we make the decisions is illegal. That's a bad option. Or we're going to just scrap the whole thing. That's a bad option. So there's just a bunch of bad options here. And what you actually decide to do is not just going to be a technical decision. It's not a decision for a data scientist as such. It's an ethical and business decision that needs to be made. Okay, explainability. The reason why there's still lots of risk on the table with regards to explainability is that it's not that nobody knows what it is that there's a complete failure of an articulation of what explainability consists in. So just to give you a flavor of that, who are you trying to explain to? If the explanation is meant to be intelligible, is it intelligible for a data scientist, intelligible to a regulator, intelligible to the average citizen? These different people, these different classes of people need different kinds of explanations, and just saying we need explainability doesn't tell you what would count as a good explanation for whom you're giving the explanation. It also doesn't tell you what counts or what are the criteria for a good explanation. I can give you a bad explanation. Have I satisfied the criteria of explainability? Presumably not. I need to give a good explanation. All right, well, now we need to get into the details about what constitutes a good explanation. And most people don't really talk about that. Certainly not in business. And then when it comes to privacy, you'll hear companies talk about privacy a lot, but what they're usually talking about are things like compliance with GDPR or CCPA if you're in California, or they'll talk about cybersecurity practices. Those are really important ways of thinking about privacy, ways of safeguarding privacy, but they're not the only. There are other substantive ethical questions around who ought to have the control of what data under what conditions for how long and so on. And those are the kinds of ethical questions that surround privacy that businesses are at the moment not very good at asking, let alone answering. And then the last thing I'll say, why there's still a bunch of risk on the table, is that the three dark horsemen of AI ethics are a big deal. Bias, explainability, and privacy are big deals. The problem is a lot of the ethical risk of AI doesn't come from those three things. It comes from the particular use case. So to take one example that everyone is familiar with, think about self-driving cars. The main ethical concerns around self-driving cars is not bias, explainability, and privacy. It's maiming and killing. So a lot of times you're not going to be able to get a grip on the ethical risks of some particular model unless you think very carefully about the ways in which various ethical risks can be realized given the use case at hand. And most businesses don't think about those kinds of things. They just think, right, AI ethics, bias bad, use technical tool, the end. So again, a tremendous amount of risk still on the table. Use case matters. Okay, last thing I really want to say. When you're thinking about AI ethics, and more specifically, AI ethical risk management, identification, mitigation, et cetera, in business, I think it's very helpful to distinguish between structure and content. So when I talk about structure, the structure, or if you like, governance of a business with regards to AI ethical risks is an answer to the question, how are you systematically identifying and mitigating ethical risks? What are the things that you have in place? What does the upskilling look like? What are the role-specific responsibilities of data collectors, of engineers, of product developers, of product owners? If they smell ethical smoke, what's the alarm that they pull? To whom does that alarm go? Is it a deliberative body? What's the jurisdiction of that deliberative body? What powers does it have? Who's on it? What are the criteria for membership? so on and so forth. So that's how do we do it? We have all these measures in place. That's the structure of an AI ethical risk program within a business or any organization, really. The content question is an answer to what are the ethical risks you're trying to mitigate. So discrimination, bias, explainability, blah, 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 killing, maiming, so on. This distinction between structure and content can really come into relief if you think about the KKK. You can imagine the KKK having an amazing governance structure, right? They have role-specific responsibilities, the engineers have responsibilities, they have an ethics board, they've got all that stuff. Except what they're doing is they want to make sure that they discriminate against everyone who's not white. They really want to maintain white supremacy and so, or sustain white supremacy. And so what they want to do is make sure that they have biased data sets. They make sure that in the particular use case that white people will be advantaged over not white people, so on and so forth, right? They can have an absolutely enviable AI ethics governance structure, but the content is all wrong. Right? It's terrible ethical content. So there's a separate question about when we talk about AI ethics and ethical risk, it's really helpful to distinguish between what's the structure that we need to have in place and how are we thinking about the content of the ethical risks that we want to avoid. Incidentally, this is why a lot of appeals to highfalutin principles don't do anything. People will say, oh, what are the ethical risks that we're trying to mitigate? Well, listen, we are for fairness, and we're for anything that's we're not for anything that's unfair. We're against unfairness. But again, the KKK signs up for that principle too. The KKK says, yeah, we'll sign a paper that says we're for fairness. They have a very different conception about what's the proper account of fairness, but nonetheless, they will affirm that they are for fairness. So when you specify the content that you're endorsing, it has to be more than some high-level value that brings in literally everyone under that umbrella. So what businesses should be asking are, what are the AI ethical risks that we should be on the lookout for? That's a question about content. And the second question is, how do we build a comprehensive program that systematically and exhaustively identifies and manages those risks? And that's obviously a question about structure. I've got more things to say, but I'd rather hear from you. So thanks very much. And if you want to hear some more or read some stuff that I've written recently, that's a title of an HBR article that I recently published. That's about how do you build that overall program. Although I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Reid. I think we really enjoyed the talk, and you rightly mentioned, that whenever we talk about AI ethics, businesses will turn quickly to bias and bias mitigation tools, the detection tools, and what are the issues that they could encounter in that. I think people are going to love the 3 dark horsemen that you have mentioned, and AI for good and AI for not bad. I think these are 2 aspects that people need to recognize when they build their systems or develop their systems with an ethical approach. What are the risks on the table, and how are you going to, deal with them, not just looking at the regulation side of it, but from a comprehensive business approach. I think this is what we are looking for. And thank you for explaining about content and structure and what are the questions the businesses are going to be asking themselves when they build their systems with ethical AI into them and integrating it into their culture as well. Thank you. Thank you so much, Reid. And I will just have a look at whether there are any questions and take them up.
Certainly got time for one, I think, but I haven't seen any. How do you modify an ethically based business from Varun? That's a question. Sorry, Jaisal.
No problem at all. Yeah, Richard, please carry on.
Yeah, how do you modify an ethically biased business? So I'm not totally sure what that means. I mean, does that mean that the business itself is biased, or that some particular product that they're pushing out is biased? One thing I'll say, I always like to say at least a little bit something controversial. One thing that I think people think when they think about bias, and the solution is we need diversity on the engineering team, the data science team, the product development team, et cetera. Now, to be clear, I am all for diverse teams. That sounds great. I think it should be a priority for HR and for senior leadership generally. That said, it's not at all obviously the best strategy for mitigating bias in AI, because mitigating bias in AI is a function of knowing where the bias creeps in. And standardly, that happens at places like the following: the particular data set that you've collected. Now, you need to do a certain kind of qualitative and quantitative analysis of that data set, and that requires a certain kind of skill set that doesn't obviously track the demographics of the person who's doing the analysis. How you set your objective function, how you set your threshold. Those are all really substantive ethical questions where bias can creep in. And though we're not going to answer those questions by just saying we need a diverse team. We do need a diverse team. That doesn't mean it's the best for a variety of reasons relating to social justice. That doesn't mean it's the best strategy for mitigating bias, given that there's lots of ways that it can creep in, and different strategies for identifying and mitigating those biases is important. I didn't quite answer your question. I'll say one more thing maybe. Generally, I think that what we do need is something like, so in medicine, what you have is IRBs in the States. I don't know what you call them in the UK or other countries, but before you conduct research on human subject in medicine, you have to get approval from a board. And that board is comprised of relevant experts, including at least one person not associated with the organization. So there's an absence of conflict of interest. That's the sort of thing that I think we need in AI. We need AI IRBs to help companies vet for ethical risks as a whole, to comprehensively vet for ethical risks, including helping them think through where biases might creep in and articulating, devising, et cetera, bias identification and mitigation strategies.
And I think there is one more question that I could see in your work, Reid. Where do you meet the most resistance or challenge in consulting for companies wanting to improve AI risk management? You hear a lot about ethics washing.
Yeah, so there's certainly ethics washing. Those people don't come to me. They know not to come to me because that's not what I do. You know, I'm in the business of helping them actually put ethical risk identification and mitigation into practice. So those people don't come to me. I don't meet, in some sense, you know, the resistance, it's not really so much resistance necessarily. Sometimes it's just a sort of lack of awareness. And events like this help to boost awareness. So it's less resistance and more lack of awareness. And then look, here's the thing. As an academic ethicist, when you're having conversations in sort of, if you like, the ethics classroom, if it's unethical, then that means all things considered, you ought not to do it. That's almost what it amounts to. You just don't do it. It's ethically wrong, don't do it. In a business context, ethical considerations are one set of considerations among many. There's also, you know, if you like, bottom line considerations, there's budget considerations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I wouldn't quite say, I wouldn't count this as resistance, but I'd say there are pragmatic, if you like, or let's just say non-ethical, not necessarily unethical, but non-ethical considerations that businesses need to take into account in their operations. And those are always going to get weighed against ethical concerns. And it goes both ways. Sometimes certain kinds of practices are outweighed by ethical concerns. So it's less a matter of resistance, and sometimes it's a matter of priorities. And then, you know, sometimes those businesses are correct that ethical AI is not their top priority. Sometimes they're wrong about it.
Thank you. Thanks, Reid. There's one more question. I mean, if you could give your valuable insight. Public level social ethical questions are valuable and open to public influenceable, yet institutional or agencies are often closed, especially when dealing with adversaries who are capable of posing an existential threat. What would you like to say about this thought?
Sorry, say that one more time.
Public level social ethical questions are valuable and open to public influence, yet institutions are often closed when dealing with adversaries who are capable of posing an existential threat.
So is the issue that that the ethical discussions within companies are opaque to the public? Is that the concern?
I think so. Yes, that's
yeah. So look, here's what would be helpful for there to be more of a public conversation about. Okay, so there's the ethically impermissible and there's the ethically permissible. Let's just distinguish between that, right? You've got the impermissible on the one hand and the permissible on the other. Within the permissible, there's a range of acceptable but incompatible ethical stances, right? So think about politics, for instance. You can be on the left, you can be on the right, and as long as you're not bonkers left or bonkers right, you've got conflicting viewpoints, but you're in the realm of ethical acceptability. What we need, if you like, from regulations is something like, here's the line of the ethically impermissible, right? So these kinds of things that could lead to absolutely disastrous consequences, that's impermissible, no company should be allowed it. But we at the same time have to allow that there's some set of ethical positions that one can take that people will disagree with, but nonetheless are ethically permissible. And so so the thing to focus on, and then if those conversations within businesses are internal and about things that fall within the realm of the ethically permissible, and they're opaque, that strikes me as fine. I'm sure I could find an exception to the rule, but that strikes me as fine.
Yeah, thanks, Reid. There's one last question. How do you incorporate these metrics in small companies, especially startups in early stage? Is this something we see value?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, my clients range from Ernst Young, EY, to startups, including some seed startups, some Series B, et cetera. It's actually a lot easier in startups because you don't have to turn around a big ship, right? Once you have a big company, you've got to turn around this ethically questionable ship, or you've got a team of hundreds of data scientists and engineers. That's hard because you have to do some major organizational change. When I work with startups, it's a lot easier because number one, if a startup has brought somebody like me in, you have buy-in from senior leadership, which you absolutely need if you're going to be successful, and you don't have as much organization to change. And so you can.
A few days later, and a hot.
Is that me or someone else? And so you can do a lot around what are the ethical standards for data collection, data storage, data sharing. What are our ethical standards in product development, product deployment, monitoring, et cetera? What are those standards? How do we meet them? Can we create KPIs for those things? Can we track progress of our ethics program? Not just what we have in place now, but we're a startup. Let's say we're growing fast. How do we make sure that we track the scaling of our ethics program as our company scales? That stuff is not that, I won't say it's not difficult, it requires commitment, but it's easier than some big company. And in response to the question about VCs, there are absolutely a set of VCs, it's a subset of VCs, who really take the ethics stuff really seriously. Sometimes they won't say the word ethics. Sometimes they'll say the word sustainable. Sometimes they'll say they'll use the acronym ESG for environmental, social, and governance standards. So they'll talk about doing an ESG due diligence for portfolio companies. I in fact work with some VCs to help them do that sort of thing. Some VCs don't care at all. They just get as much data as you can, make as much money as you can, and give me a good exit, right? That's all they care about. You probably also don't want their money. Probably. If you're here on this call, you probably don't want their money anyway. So I think if you drive ethics into your startup organization and you're looking for funding, you'll probably want more values-driven money, and you're more likely to attract that values-driven money from VCs if you've already taken ethics really seriously internally.
Yeah, I think that really makes sense, Reid. And thank you for your talk. And there are some lovely comments in the chat. You can just look at that and answer any questions if they come up. Thank you. And now over to you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Jason. Reid, thank you so much. Reid, in the last just minute before we hand over to Paul for the last talk, you talked about all different kinds of VCs there, but is there the bigger money? I mean, Clubhouse just got $110 million. They very much got a kind of route A on data that you were describing that isn't potentially ethical. Can you raise $100 million from a VC and have these kind of ethics in place?
Oh, well, you're talking to me still. Can you raise, sorry, the question was, can you raise that kind of money and have VCs? Say that again?
Yeah, just when you talked about different VCs, can you still raise the Clubhouse level $110 million? I think it was Series B they got, and have these kind of ethics in place?
I see absolutely no reason why not. I mean, there's absolutely investors who are looking to make those kinds of ethical investments. Not all of them, don't get me wrong. Some investors will absolutely roll their eyes. Right? There's no question that some of them are going to roll in. All right, glad for ethical. Great that you put ethics in there, but like, What's my ROI? Right? And then there's going to be others who are positively ecstatic that you put ethics in there. So it's just going to vary. There's not, you know.
And BlackRock will say that climate risk,
it's not
finance risk, right?
So there's two things to say. There's two other things to say. One is that, remember, when you're doing ethics in a startup, you're doing two things. One, you're doing risk mitigation. You're also doing competitive advantage and branding, right? So one of my Series B clients, they're in the business of taking a tremendous amount of data from enterprise clients and pulling it all together, unsiloing that data, making it searchable, making the data available for training ML, so on and so forth. They absolutely need the trust of those clients, right? They need to be able to go to that chief privacy officer of the Fortune 500 company or Global 1000 or whatever, and say, oh, you can trust us with your data. Here are all the things that we've put in place to ensure the ethical stewardship of your data. That's massive competitive advantage against another company, another startup who says, oh yeah, no, yeah, we take it seriously. And we have an ethics statement. Here's the statement, right? If you can point to that chief privacy officer or that CISO or whomever and say, yeah, we take the ethics really seriously. Here are the concrete things we do. We can even share with you the ways our policies are written in a way to incorporate those ethical standards, the way that those policies incorporate instructions for what it constitutes a successful implementation of that policy, the way that every policy includes KPIs to measure how successful we are in the implementation of those ethical risk policies, and provide that to your potential buyer. That's a huge competitive advantage, and any VC loves competitive advantage.